When I think about what if we get it right, it's not a technology question. It's a how can we be better humans question. How can we come together and each find our roles in making this transformation that we need to sort of like acknowledge the current status quo is really not working for very many people, and think about how we build a climate future where that's like a world we want to live in, a place where we can actually thrive.
Yeah. I started reading the science fiction writer Kim Stanley Robinson a few years ago. Mm-hmm. And your work reminds me of him in the sense that...
Well, that's a compliment.
Yeah, well,
he's a very good writer.
I've read 5 or 6 of his books, and I just find them so compelling. And I think one way I have tried to summarize to people kind of what I hear him saying is, similarly, as we've already said, we're screwed, and yet there's hope, and there are solutions. And don't place your hope in these sorts of idyllic utopian visions of a technological society, because it's more complicated than that. But I don't know, any commentary on that?
Yeah, I mean, his work really encourages us to imagine a totally different type of future.
Yeah.
And I feel like imagination is one of the things we most need right now. I, for example, would really like Hollywood to become more involved in telling stories about climate, not more documentaries, but more stories that just help us see what the world looks like if we implement all these climate solutions. Because I think part of the challenge is people don't want to race towards this future that's just this big blank unknown. And so while we have all of this media showing us what the bad version of the future looks like, right? We've got like a pretty clear vision of the apocalypse. We don't actually have a lot of visions of, like, what's the good thing? Like, what should I work towards? Like, how can I be motivated, not just by running away from the bad stuff, but having something to run towards? And so I try to do a little bit of that with this book, but I really think it's a time for artists, filmmakers, storytellers, musicians to help us to paint that in like all of its multicolored glory, and help us like get a more tangible sense of what we want to create together, so we can get excited about rolling up our sleeves and putting in the effort that's going to take, because like there's a lot of work we need to do.
Right. Yeah.
And that can be really hard to be motivated. We're just like, it's going to be apocalypse anyway. Like, why bother?
Yeah. You have 2 beautiful quotes, one from Arundhati Roy. What lies ahead? Reimagining the world. Only that.
Yeah.
And then from Angela Davis, you have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time. Beautiful, beautiful.
Yeah.
If you'll allow me to geek out for a moment.
I couldn't put it any better than them. So I just put those quotes right on their own separate pages in the book for people to appreciate.
If you'll allow me to geek out for a minute. So in Christian theology, this would be called a proleptic ethic. The idea that so proleptic being a grammatical form in which you speak of the future of what is to come. You're so sure that it's to come that you speak of it in the present tense. And so this sort of notion of having this fertile imagination of what the world is going to be or can be, and then you act on that in the present. And your stuff on imagination, I think, is so helpful, because a lot of the so-called apocalyptic literature in the Hebrew Bible or in the Christian New Testament, a lot of it is kind of doom and gloom, but it's doom and gloom as a sort of notion of that all that is about violence or all that is about destruction will be undone itself, and then life and beauty and sharing and hospitality will all then be in great abundance. And then, of course, I think your thing about imagination as well is really helpful, because in too much of my experience, I find too many religious folks who don't have a sufficient imagination for this earth. and they kind of have this kind of escapist vision, so that as if this earth doesn't matter, which is, deeply troubling to me, and I would imagine deeply troubling to you. But I don't know, any commentary on that, the proleptic piece, or imagine further things on the imagination, or the ways our big stories fuel this? I
really appreciate sort of like the theological grammar of it, right? Just speaking it into being, the
right.
sort of investment in the story such that you are making it real. And I think there's definitely a need for that when we think about the future of life on Earth, right? And one of my favorite aspects of this merging of Christianity and climate action is this concept of creation care, that it's less about dominion, although there's different, sort of like etymologies of that word, which would make it less about exerting power and control over, but more about this coming into alignment with this idea of creation care. Like, what do we as humans owe to these other magnificent species that we're sharing the planet with? Like, wouldn't it be awful to destroy God's creation? Like, who are we to do that? Like, this magnificent biodiversity of life.